Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of the Molinella fought on July the 25th, 1467, between the Italic League, commanded by Federico da Montefeltro, and the coalition headed by Venice and commanded by Bartolomeo Colleoni. Now, this is a very interesting battle that I didn't know in detail. It's one of those names from the condottieri, from the many condottieri battles that more or less, resound, but also because of the balance that, as we'll see, they fundamentally always brought, often tactically, but also strategically, in this phase that we discussed on Schwerpunkt in a couple of videos about the so-called Italian policy of equilibrium that followed the Peace of Lodi 1454. They were brought to a radical, shift in the, let's say, strength ratios in the peninsula, and thus seem as if they weren't of not great importance. Also, I'll say that this specific battle, as others of the condottieri and the condottieri in general, right, suffered of a bad press because of the work of Machiavelli, that naturally, given its overwhelming cultural impact in modern Western culture, has somewhat biased the judgment of many, let's say, of historiography in general, right? There are certain moments in history that are not studied at all, others that are very studied but still present historiographically a certain bias and so on. And Italian military history is not very much studied at all, telling the truth. And properly, there is a lack of systematic analysis on these battles. So much, in fact, that I didn't have enough sources on the Molinella, and I had my library, scanning some digitalization about the existing works. There are basically just a couple of articles on this battle. They're not even a great deal from terms of tactical analysis. That is what we do today normally for the battle videos series, to say. And that I had to reconstruct a bit by myself. Unfortunately enough, not even these articles provided me with an adequate bibliography that would list especially the sources of these single, the single chroniclers or the single authors that dealt with the clash. Some are later, some are from the 16th century, others even later. Some I have read, right, and I must say that I faced somewhat a common problem to the to Renaissance to Renaissance historiography. That is to say, that differently from, I don't know, if you had studied Italian battles 150 years before, you would have found plenty of sources, even too many in a sense, with a good amount of detail and the capacity of properly of a scientific reconstruction on the base of formations, of tactics employed, and so on. Which is not an easy exercise, by the way, because there is always a lot to contextualize. That is to say, in medieval warfare, I realized that also through my PhD thesis that fundamentally there is not been yet a systematic comparative and diachronic study of medieval warfare itself. You think, we are in 2021. At this point, historiography has covered more or less everything. Yes, it has, but has not connected the various dots, right? Aside from properly certain gaps that, as we were saying before, are not filled yet. But properly, maybe a person studies in ultra detail a certain battle, but has literally no idea what the warfare of the time concretely was, right? And therefore presents with some problems, right, of interpretation, and eventually people copy also as a method, etc. It's as if there's a sort of timidity. I don't know why this is. So, we have surpassed I think, generally speaking, at least in historiography, that phase of fear towards, the study of military history itself, especially in continental Europe. But still, we lack, as a consequence of the previous time, this structural capacity. sometimes. And the Battle of the Molinella is very fascinating, both for tactical and strategical reasons. I would like to foretell that because of the aforementioned reasons, I have provided here with a tactical reconstruction of the battle, but I'm almost completely sure it's not entirely correct. Meaning that, as far as I understood from the sources, the Renaissance chroniclers normally didn't approach the things center because they weren't there. You see, that this was a time in which these were humanists, sheltered by, some from the very lords that would fight in these battles, etc., but were, panegyrically exalting them and not really scientifically analyzing the battle because it was no interest, it was properly no need, ideologically speaking, to do it. Especially in this case. For example, in this battle, you have Montefeltro and Colleoni that are famously some of the greatest commanders of their time, the most famous condottieri in absolute terms, and Dries, for example, all a let's say a bit of bias, right? The idea of what would, for example, who won this battle, right? Nobody knows. This was fundamentally a tactical style, as we will see. In the broader strategical sense, it was the Venetians who lost, right? Colleoni attacked also tactically, and in the sense he was halted, so, and eventually retreated. So he was kind of defeated in that sense. So if you want to look at the tip of the balance, it's more in favor fundamentally of Montefeltro. And there are, as we will see, also concrete reasons for this, that is Colleoni was also numerically disadvantaged, that the strategical situation hadn't been the better ones. There were all political reasons why things had gone like that, but had actually he won at the Battle of the Molinella, Venice, that was sponsoring Colleoni, but trying also to keep an eye on him, and we'll understand why, would have probably managed to not to overrun central southern Italy and probably extending its hegemony all over the peninsula at some point, but surely it would have changed a big deal, right, in terms properly of strategical areas of control. So a bit of the background here. So as we were saying, the Italic League here was mobilized because of, in parallel with the Venetian effort, to essentially bring order in the Romagnol area where the battle was fought. After that, Piero de' Medici in Florence had exiled the so-called the Poggio faction, that were some very powerful noble Florentine families that had opposed the Medicean rule, and that had taken refuge, in fact, in the Romagnol area. That, as you know, in this, if you look at the political map of Italy, there are these macro areas that are, fundamentally the sphere of influence of mainly the greatest powers were Venice, Milan, the Papal States, Florence, and Naples, right? And however, in between there were other, like, I don't know, altogether there would have been like 30 lesser states, right? And the Romagnol area was some of the most fragmented one. Historically, it was also one of the most turbulent. Some of it provided some of the finest mercenaries. Historically, I mean, even Montefeltro technically emerged from that background. And in this context, the Florentine exiles had created a league with Venice, with the Est, and with other powers and noblemen, single noblemen in this sense, that were condottieri, were lords of certain cities, etc., that were very important in the broader balance of Italy at the time, to come back in Florence, and naturally supported by these powers that were interested in knocking out the Medici and taking over the city and all the enormous, financial power from the Florentine banks and so on. So, for this reason, it was about war in 1467. Since spring, everything was being prepared, and Venice was the leader of the anti-Florentine, anti-Medicean coalition, had mobilized her best commander, Bartolomeo Colleoni, who he incarnates a bit the prototype of the condottiero at the time. He was schooled at the time of the Sforza and the Montone. He had fought in an impressive amount of encounters, and also for this reason the service of Venice earned a great power that he fundamentally compacted around his native Bergamo in Lombardy. By the way, on the not surprisingly in a sense on the frontier with Milan, that had undergone recently some important changes with the passage from the Visconti to the Sforza dynasties, and that Colleoni had managed to threaten, right, so much that he fundamentally wanted to take over Milan, and militarily speaking, he was properly at this point still hoping to do so. Colleoni had an important amount of lands, etc. He was creating kind of another little state on its own, and his plan here was fundamentally that he proposed to the Venetian Senate was to knock out the various Italic contingents in detail, right, before they could regroup. That because this was altogether a very large force, so he especially preferred to begin from Lombardy and hoping to defeat the Sforza contingent immediately and then taking directly over Milan. And Venice was not very happy with this, because naturally they feared that Colleoni would fundamentally abuse of that power eventually, and also it would have, since fundamentally he was fighting for Venice, albeit sometimes he had even passed at the service of other powers, including Florence recently and so on, but still as fundamentally as a Venetian agent by a certain degree. Venice didn't want all the rest of Italy to point a finger at her and saying, you were the one who broke the Treaty of Lodi altogether. And even though the Italic League, that was in this sense, gathering an army to defend the policy of balance, would have, grouped its army, and then Venice would have, at that point said, okay, I can't do anything else now but respond, because somebody has come armed against me, and it's as if at that point I was justified to attack. And also because, as we were saying before, had the, as we will see, the Florentine, Papal, and Neapolitan contingents being knocked out, the Venetians might have been capable of acquiring a dramatic power, right, in the central and southern part of the peninsula, and with consequences that objectively might have been of a large scale, historically speaking, right? So the Venetian Senate anteposed politics to strategy, prohibiting Colleoni to strike the Milanese immediately, right? And he was pretty scorned by that, but nevertheless he obeyed. Military preparations had been quite thorough. Colleoni himself trained his own troops, had prepared them especially for long marches. He had received from the Venetian Republic some of very fine artillery pieces that in this battle, as we will see, will have an important role, albeit not just from Colleoni's side, because even in here historiography has a bit exalted the thing. Some later claims on how this artillery was practically used in battle are somewhat late and perhaps unreliable in that regard, but Colleoni surely was a forerunner in these kind of tactics. He's credited to have introduced for the first time artillery moved on the field on carriage, right, so increasing the mobility especially of the culverins, of the falconets, that were lighter than bombards and could be, with adequate training of their crews, etc. That for this reason he, underposed to intense training, could really puzzle the enemy, and especially in this attack that we will see was tactically achieved. That taking position in a very speedy time and exploiting firepower, artillery firepower, proficiently. He would make them calculate also the various ratios for the amount of of powder for the weight of the ball, and also the important the balance of substance within would be on a charge. 7 of components of saltpeter 1 of sulfur and 3 of carbon. There was some definitions we're mastering here, the remelting technology as well, that provided lighter, more resistant guns. This is quite interesting. In the opposite field, the Bolognese were also preparing. Bologna at this point was siding with the Italic League, and since the war would have been brought fundamentally within its area, right, between Emilia and Romagna, there was a concrete risk that a defeat of the Italic League would have brought to a regime change in Bologna that was held at the time by the John II Bentivoglio, that produced an impressive cannon. For example, it was sent to battle, but given the terrain, as we will see later, it wouldn't be used. But the Bolognese, for example, had a lot of what the Italians called scioppetti at that point, and that seemingly had an important role in the battle. The other powers involved, as we've seen, was were Urbino, controlled by the Montefeltro. Then there were some. There was Florence, the Papal States. Paul II was sending the Orsini, commander that would have an important role in the battle, but he was somewhat secretly hoping that the Montefeltro would lose, in a sense, because of political balance, to the weakening of Aragonese Naples in favor of the papacy. These are bit voices just, but as you know, Italy of the second half of the 15th century was fundamentally really about this, right? There wasn't the Neapolitans that sent, in fact, Ferdinand II of Naples sent the San Severino commander, also an important role in the battle. The Florentines sent their own troops. There were other minor powers. From the Venetian side, I will use Venetian or Corleone's side, given that Corleone had his own private army, as you understand, as a condottiere. Then there were also Venetian troops that were brought actually under his training in spring. Then there would be actually some Sforza exiles. The Sforzino was the half brother of the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Maria Sforza. And then also probably the brother of Galeazzo was Alessandro Sforza of Cotignola. It was Lord of Pesaro at the time. Yes, I forgot, there was also the Milanese contingent from the side of the Italic League, because Galeazzo Maria Sforza, after the death of his father, had risen to the dukedom and had found out basically the large, the military policy of Milan had brought to the increase of debt towards the Florentines, to which at this point he was kind of obliged, and he joined the Italic coalition against Corleone himself, and seeing the threat also that, as we've seen, the Condottiere and Venice had posed to the Duchy of Milan. So more or less, this is there were other smaller lords such as Galeotto of Mirandola and Marco Pio Carpi, for example. These were Emilian commanders. It's coming from those more fragmented areas in between the major regional states, and so on. Right. So this is more or less the force, and so Corleone basically went down from Lombardy into Emilia. And he actually tried initially to. His plan would have been fundamentally to attack Montefeltro while the Papal, Florentine, and Neapolitan reinforcements would have not arrived. But while crossing the Po, he was blocked by the Marquis of Mantua that prevented the crossing through in his own land. So this gave more time to the Italics to gather forces. So Corleone was frustrated by this. He descended into Emilia, then eventually in Romagna, but he had lost time, and there were some interesting operations, even some sieges, etc. In which, by the way, Colleoni showed, the important artillery power that his army had against the Montefeltro that was holding fundamentally, but still moving away, still waiting for his allies, so frustrating Colleoni's plan to knock him out before the others. So at the end of the day, the Italic League managed to get all its pieces together: the Milanese, the Florentine, the Papalines, the Neapolitans, and Colleoni had to fight. A very important ally of the Venetian army, say, were the Este, right? The Este were these important and old nobiliar house in the northeast of Italy that at that point would have importantly benefited from a Venetian victory in the area, and the brother of the Marquis of Este, Ercole, joined the Venetians as well, with an important contingent that will in fact save actually the battle for Colleoni, as far as we understand. So there are interesting moves here before the battle that we can't quite picture. Here I made a little map myself that illustrates, in the absence of other ones that I found, more or less what, according to me, the clash went like, at least in the major features. There are some gaps in here. Sources, for example, mention also Astore Manfredi, Lord of Faenza, that initially sided with the Italic League, but when Colleoni passed by his city, joined him. And we know he had a somewhat important role in the battle, but we don't know which one. Some of the information properly I sketched out here in the map are somewhat conjectural, right? The places are correctly represented. Here, basically, I also put the symbols of some... This was a very marshy area, right? It was close to the various branches of the Po towards the Adriatic Sea, and the battle was fought alongside the Indice River. This area was very unhealthy, was marshy. There was malaria in there, so much that Colleoni also seemingly got sick there and would die 8 or 9 years later after having had these recurrent fevers. So it's probably he caught malaria in that point. On July the 25th, here it was really hot, right? Sultry. The weather was terrifying in this sense, and this is stressed by the sources that you can imagine this man, like in the 15th century, is the moment of greatest armoredness, let's say, on the field, plus with all these logistical effort, bringing in the artillery, etc. So you can imagine this difficult ground with that weather, it's a freaking mess, right? And there are some interesting movements before the battle that took place here out of the picture of my sketch that, however, have to do with Colleoni's approach to the to Montefeltro's camp. Colleoni was coming from Faenza, and he is stationed in Lugo, in the east of Castel Guelfo, that instead was Montefeltro's camp. So at a certain point, Montefeltro expected some kind of contact at that point. The troops had already spotted each other in most advanced positions, etc. But eventually Colleoni took up a turn north. He went into the city of Argenta, that is just east of Molinella, a few, like 10 kilometers, a bit more maybe. So here east of the map. And interestingly enough, Montefeltro didn't know this, and in the day, you see, the battle began at 4 p.m. or at least the movements were before, just in afternoon, but the engagement began at full scale that hour. And during the morning, and the day before, both armies had actually made important strains, because Colleoni was marching from the day before in this very rapid movement to essentially make a great turn towards the north and to fall onto the western enemy flank, right? And crossing, as you can see from the map, the Indice River in this coming from Molinella and crossing. You see Mezzolara here, I made the little bridge right? So, and facing, so therefore passing from the other side of where he was coming from, let's say, on the enemy, having the Indus River protecting his troops, also with the marshy ground, because as we will see now, the Italics had an important advantage numerically and especially in cavalry. That was the decisive arm, and therefore he thought that on that difficult ground he could compensate for that disadvantage and rely more on infantry combined with artillery fire. And Federico da Montefeltro instead had marched in the previous night or morning, I don't remember, into the area where he thought that Colleone was encamped, and he actually found nobody. He found probably some camp attendants that still remained there, but he found the enemy army to have left. And this is important because by the time the two armies began the fight, they were exhausted by these previous marches in the previous hours and days, right? And as I was saying, think about the weather, right? Interestingly enough, also it seems that Federico da Montefeltro had lowered guard when he found out that the enemy army had gone away and they had moved towards, here you see the town of the village of Budrio, where he had set camp, and he was quite confident probably that there wasn't so much of a trouble going on. Here in the picture of the battlefield, I inserted some marshy areas, as I was saying before, that I will explain why it's the case, right? We have okay, well, this will be better told during the battle analysis that we also can't begin. However, we have to list before the the two armies and what they were about and what we think they were equipped like, especially in terms of artillery. So, interestingly enough, this was a pretty large battle for time standards, right? The condottieri forces normally, as you know, were contained, right? Because they costed a lot. They mostly were sent out there for limited strategical purposes, and so that they could be called off in case of need. Also, they wouldn't cost too much. They were importantly effective. They were founded on heavy cavalry fundamentally, and here we see the spread of artillery, what was making the thing being heavier. So it's kind of nice when people hear people say, these condottieri battles were kind of small after all. No, they weren't small. They weren't small, and this is also another interesting aspect of this battle, for which the armies are large fundamentally, for times being. So there are different chroniclers, historians, etc., about the two armies that mostly tell you, was who there of the most important characters. Here we skip them a little bit, but fundamentally, they were some of the most important players in Italian politics at the time. But as far as that scientific reconstruction of the army altogether, Renaissance sources tend to drive a little bit away from the average, which would, actually falling a bit more into what had been the medieval average of the time, meaning that Italian historiography had been dramatically advanced up to, let's say, 1 century before, incomparably with the rest of Europe, and still at this point, as you know, the Italians were pioneering, the historiography or the linguistics of classical sort, etc. They produced a lot, but still, that, as we were saying, that drawing away with the rise of the lordships, the drawing away of the citizen, of the soldier from daily political and military life had brought to these chroniclers to be more detached from events. So it's as if you can, when you read these pages, you understand they're telling because they have heard that, right? Even sometimes at different time, space, of distance, practically not really, being able to tell much because they weren't there. So there are important authors such as Muzio, Baldi, Gherardacci, Ammirato, right? There are at least, temporally the closest authors to the facts, right? And we can assess fundamentally the Venetian army, let's call it in this way, Saint Mark. At the time, the sources were the this faction was known as the Marqueschi because of Saint Mark's Republic, right? So the Markians, in a sense. They were up to 6,000 cavalry and 6,700 infantry. The single participants' contributions was the same. The Colleone's company, Venice, and the Florentine exiles had brought 3,000 cavalry, right, and 2,500 infantry. Sforzino, the half brother of the Duke of Milan, was fighting against him. For here also with the other brother Alessandro, as we will see. So they were different interests. It was normal, let's say, for this side to fight even against their own relatives. Brought 600 cavalry and 2,000 infantry. Alessandro Sforza brought 1,000 cavalry and 1,200 infantry, and the Este, commanded by Ercole, 1,300 cavalry and 1,000 infantry. Now this is interesting because you see that the amount of cavalry basically equates the one of infantry, right? Which, albeit, as we were saying before, the cavalry being very important, condottieri army normally wasn't quite the same. Normally was the ratio cavalry infantry was something like 1 to 4, right? Maybe slightly less, but already at that point it started becoming like less usual, because infantry after all was important, right? Handguns, anti-cavalry were quite there. Aside even from artillery, that surely needed infantry protection for that matter. The Italic League had after all a similar number of troops, but greater than the enemy, 6,500 cavalry and almost 8,000 infantry. So 2,000 cavalry and 1,500 infantry had been brought by the Montefeltro. 1,500 cavalry and 1,500 infantry had been brought by with the Orsini and the San Severino, so from Rome and Naples respectively. Then 2,000 cavalry by the Milanese of Galeazzo Sforza, together with 2,000 infantry, while the Bolognese were a bit more traditional in army composition. 1,000 cavalry and 3,000 infantry. John II Bentivoglio would have come to the battle. He was also, a condottiere himself. I mean, he had commanded armies, participated to campaigns, but he was he remained in Bologna because of the fear of a coup during his absence and the one of the army, right? So he was properly, also by his allies, said, remain there, right? Because it's important that Bologna doesn't fall. That Bologna at this point was fundamentally under this, like the Montefeltro, there were papal signories in technic within the papal states, and it was a big city, and so it was particularly important not to lose control of it, right? Relatively to the equipment of these troops, we can roughly say, okay, there were lances, halberds, crossbows, also bows, arquebuses, and artillery, right? And as we've seen, the Italic League had more infantry, but seemingly, but here we can't be completely sure, it was less provided with culverins, espringals, and falconets that were more rapid than the bombards normal for tactical deployment. But the idea that there was some sort of disparity in here fundamentally derives from the anecdote about Colleone that would have used, especially culverins, in a very effective manner on the field. Flavio Biondo, that is a 16th century Italian humanist, wrote, but distant from these events, wrote that during this battle, the Lombard condottiere would have carried out a sort of, very interesting, actually, combined tactic by making infantry advance and then eventually opening on the sides, turning towards the sides, and having artillery behind them shooting at point-blank range with this mobile artillery brought right behind against the enemy. Right, these things shot at mitraille like, you know, little lead cubes, darts, you know, nails, things like that. And this is indeed, we know it happened because also aspirin gauges, etc. were used, but were also used from the other side. And as far as I understand, albeit one of the sources stresses the importance of Colleone's artillery, there is one other source that says that actually was Montefeltro who made first use of this artillery on carriage and this very effective you know, artillery tactic. So it kind of reversed the thing. Who's right, who's wrong, we'll never know, likely. As it is likely, though, that basically all these armies had some fundamental homogeneity in their own military technologies, and it might have, of course, they might have differed in the amount of artillery brought on the field, but more or less, right? We can't say maybe that objectively the Venetians had more firepower in a sense that, as we'll see, fits in general with what they did, also properly in the field with the ground they took, to what they were up to, but we know, for example, that the same Ercole d'Este was shot in his foot by an aspirin gouge, who remained crippled for all his life and complaining about, you know, these damn firearms that were spreading on the battlefields like that. So I think we can't get directly to the battlefield. There would be, as we were saying before, interesting things to say about the you know, the first movements, etc. So the picture here. I don't know, I inserted some pictures in here that do not, I mean photos from the actual place that tells you, you know, here it's the Pop Valley, it's complete flatland, right? Okay, but don't think that this is an easy ground for cavalry at all. It's full of ditches, of marshes, especially in that area, and trees, and yeah, and it's interesting because there are some sort of argents made also in the area since an early age, and there are some houses. The name of the Molinella here, as you understand, is a place, is this village, but there is this other place of Mezzolara or the Riccardina that in fact are all names that are to which these battles are fundamentally also called, because when you go studying them in the sources, everybody states a different place, because more or less, right, they wanted to say, you see, Molinella here was the larger place. But Mezzolara was closer to the place where they actually fought. So they're obviously all telling the same thing, but they're not so interested in the detail to tell us concretely what, you know, what the broader battle took place like. So, as I was saying, there are some problems in the reconstruction of the battle, mild ones, right? But still, there are mostly many gaps that do not necessarily, that there is not a fundamentally opposed view. You can reconstruct this battle in positions, etc. More or less we understand what happened. It's just that we don't have, for example, not even an idea how these, all the various contingents were stationed on the field, what movements they made, etc. So, as we were saying before, this is the first hours after noon, right? So the worst in terms of sun and of sultry, you know, the air was thick, you know, in summer. It's terrifying. On Saturday, July the 25th. So the first, you see, the idea we get from this battle that is more an impression, because as we were saying before, we don't even know exactly who won and who lost precisely. But it's evident that the first move was carried out by Colleone. Right, he wanted to fall on the enemy unexpectedly, and he partly achieved this result, because, as we were saying before, Montefeltro had somewhat lowered the guard, which is something that can reveal us maybe indirectly some detail about the terrain, and the reason why I located those marshes, essentially as you see in front of the, just north of the Riccardina, right? The reason being that you know that the enemy is in the area, right? You know he has moved, so he's probably tired. You may not expect an attack direct, especially with all this heat and everybody's exhausted. Think about the difficulty probably also of scattering your own forces along these areas. They're not heavily inhabited, right? There are this kind of villas, towers. It's an inhabited area. There are these monasteries, etc., these churches most, but it's basically it. And you still may think, so you have your left flank, since you're encamped in Budrio, protected by the Idice River, right? But the enemy may come, theoretically, from somewhere, and it's likely to believe, also for other reasons I will list afterwards, mostly drawn from the Venetian army deployment, that there was some marshy ground north of the Riccardina that was not easily passable. And at that point, Montefeltro had somewhat also loosened the line, the formation, the battle asset, right? So Colleoni was actually managing with enormous effort, and because we know that especially infantry was tired of all that march, and in fact he told, especially to the Este rear guard, to march slowly because the infantry really had difficulties to keep up with cavalry on the march. But still, he was advancing. He was the one taking the initiative and attacking, right? So this battle will fundamentally be, yes, the Venetians in attack and Montefeltro in defense. Of course, they would fundamentally attack each other all the time during combat, going back and forth, and we can't even track all the various movements, the various charges that took place across the Idice River. It's a small stream, like it's not a big thing, but it's still enough for as a form of defense, as an obstacle. In general, also, as we've seen, the surrounding areas are pretty tricky, right? Cavalry would lose a lot, especially horses, as we will see, will be killed and will have difficulty on the ground, and the infantry would attack them to kill them and overthrow the men at arms on them. So what Colleoni does here is that he wants not only to fall on Montefeltro from the north by surprise, he fundamentally wants to take him from the side, literally from the west, and therefore crossing the Idice River and attacking from there. Why this movement? Well, this would essentially favor, in his view, first of all, asserted defensive position on his own, right? Once he advanced and attacked, he would, however, stay there and launch these clashes across, as we've seen, the river. But he hoped, in fact, to mostly have to mostly block the enemy cavalry capacity in that sense. But this movement, as you understand, is also a risky one. Colleoni was at this point encamped in the Molinella, right? Or at least was starting from there. And so you see his march would contemplate going southwest and arriving in front of Mezzolara, where there was a bridge, right? And this bridge was important because he, first of all, could cross more easily the Indice there to perform its maneuver. He could keep on the supplies from the camp, also from the Molinella. Wasn't probably during the battle, they didn't need excessively much, but still, a connection bringing water, food, things, it was important. The clash went on for half a day, right, from 4 p.m. to basically the night time, right, as we will see. So, and it's obvious enough that bridge would have been very interesting for the Montefeltro as well, because the Italics may have seized the opportunity to attack, to storm, to contend the bridge to the enemy, to take control of it, and to block Colleoni from the other side of the Indice, right? And that would have been a very risky thing to do. So my intuition is, since we will see fundamentally that the majority of Colleoni's forces fundamentally crossed the Indice, and that there is no specific evidence of other troops attacking straight, let's say from Mezzolara to Budrio, like via land, without crossing any water, that there might have been some marsh in between, and not only because of that, but because we have properly the info that a detachment that was the one of Alessandro Sforza, that was sent in this place here. In this you read San Martino in Argine, that is a church fundamentally, would have difficulty to reconnect with Colleone's forces, and because of the difficult terrain he found in the middle, and this terrain in the middle, as you understand, is exactly that area that also the Montefeltro could have, the Italics could have crossed to go to bottle up Colleone from the other side of the river, blocking his crossing on the river. Because literally, also if the battle had gone seriously wrong on the left bank of the Indice River, Colleone had to withdraw. Right? He would withdraw actually from, and so coming back the way he came through the Mezzolara bridge and up to the Molinella again. So in a more disastrous situation than the ones that appears to have been, the Italics may have pressed them on and kind of blocked them, right? Blocked the enemy retreat by cutting the bridge passage, right? And this would have been quite of a risky thing, right? Because if there had been a free space there, it would have been fairly easy, right? It's a few kilometers actually to block it. But apparently also because the clash from, you see, the Montefeltro was encamped in Budrio, but the greatest clash occurred around this other little center here. You see the Riccardina, that in fact is also, as we were saying before, another name for the battle, that is not far from Mezzolara at all, right? We can imagine that the broader development of the two armies in depth would have been roughly also coming very close to Mezzolara itself. So Colleone probably was exploiting the surprise of the enemy. He was, however, probably also exploiting some kind of terrain there, because it would have not been by him, let's say, wise with his experience to actually risk that bridge be cut and no retreat to be possible. Instead, things worked just fine. And as we were saying before, Colleone had sent the contingent of Alessandro Sforza to San Martino in Argine. The Sforza was provided with 2 squads of mounted crossbowmen and 3 infantry battalions. It's not much, but it's just to hold, right, the position there. That may have been actually the contingent used to prevent the enemy to kind of cut the retreat to the Venetian army, right? That's where probably Colleone expected the enemy to be possible to eventually reach the Molinella. And we know actually that as the fight would unfold, especially during the Venetian retreat, that withdrawal, the Montefeltro's troops would actually press on the enemy through exactly that direction, or at least the same troops that Montefeltro would send to counter the Sforza there were the ones that pressed on during at the end of the battle, and that's quite interesting. So about the formation, we can't really say more than much. It seems that this battle was very confused. Normally, yes, there was an order. There were lines of battle. There is one source explicitly saying it at some point, and it's very difficult to understand the direction, because basically the front line would go around along the Indice River, right? So almost an east-west, let's say, facing of the two armies. Whereas, however, if you look at San Martino in Argine, here it's basically almost at the back of that. So there is also another dimension, that is the one north-south, also that is the one fundamentally between the two camps. So Colleone had made this great turn to literally arrive at the west of Riccardina and on the flank of the enemy army to harass them to arrest them from there, exploiting the defense line constituted by the river, and the infantry and artillery combined to stem the enemy attacks, right? So this movement was also carried out orderly, slowly, because of the aforementioned reasons. Troops were tired, and everything had to go well. Colleoni, as we've seen, had trained intensely his troops to manage them, to perform such important amount of marches, etc. And he also, so descending south, sent a large squadron towards Mezzolara to seize and pass the bridge on the Idice. That was probably not garrisoned by anybody at that point, and marching against the enemy on the left of the stream. So at this point, Montefeltro realized that Colleoni was arriving, that the enemy army was there. So he had actually barely the time to send orders of any sort, however, he told his troops to deploy on along the river, on the right bank. So not to go ahead towards the north, and that's why I think there were marshes there, why he was not warned, why he would at this point imagine, even the confusion, you don't really know where the enemy is. You have, as we'll see, probably also news that in the northeast, in San Martino, there are enemy troops, so you may really want to contemplate that northern line of battle. There is no such thing, seemingly. I personally think that there were some Venetian forces, maybe some reserve, maybe the Manfredi or somebody else, located there, probably to guard the bridge, because literally there's no info about even clashing towards the bridge. I think there is some source saying clashing towards Mezzolara, or some buildings there, but frankly, there is no mention of bridges, and that doesn't seem, that this, because as we'll see now, Montefeltro also ordered some troops to cross the same river, so it was understood that the enemy was arriving from there, and all things considered, I really believe that the terrain in the north was not practicable, and that could be at least, a good line of defense, at least for the same Montefeltro, that at that point, having still reserves that were being organized, but said, if the enemy attacks there, we have enough forces to counter them, because they have to cross the marshes, there will be disorder, and probably there wasn't much of a threat coming from there. So he sent also his Neapolitans of San Severino against the Sforza in San Martino. That area seemingly was dry, by the way, and at the same time, close to Mezzolara, on the left of the Idice stream, the Orsini had come with his Romans on probably up to that point. So he had crossed the Idice river close to Budrio and rose up on the left bank up to Mezzolara, where he engaged the Venetians. Right, and the Orsini movement was important because the Montefeltro had thus the time to organize 5 complete formations to send to the help of the Neapolitans, which is interesting because this may prove that he was still thinking that some threat could arrive distantly from there, right? Where he would have thought before the surprise of the enemy crossing with that, probably the enemy forces would have come, if not directly from the east, but still in that maybe northeast direction. As we were saying before, the battlefield is interesting because as we were saying before, it's a flatland, but it's full of argents. They're not really big works, right? But they are enough, especially for infantry to exploit and to provide some nuisance to cavalry. There are some forested areas as well around. There are some swamps, spread around, and with some, plants and swampy, pond grasses and all things like this that, are also can conceal a tricky ground, right? And it's at this point that we know that Alessandro's force in San Severino had a problem because he wouldn't manage to reach from the right bank of the Idice the viaduct that crosses the river to the center of the Riccardina. So that is important because it's exactly the kind of ground that were, as we were saying here, was probably uncovered, and that was tested in this regard. It was difficult to cross. Why was the Riccardina important? Because probably the same Montefeltro had told the same Colleoni had told to the Sforza to join there, to arrive from that side, to both presumably defend the bridge, right, because that would secure communications with the Molinella, as we've seen, but also actually open another front against Montefeltro, so that would have engaged both from the north and would have been engaged both from the north and the west. But apparently this maneuver failed, right? And still we have seen that Montefeltro had actually sent enough troops to counter the Sforza's movements there. And I don't think we have any other information about the Sforza during the battle. So in my opinion, that he probably remained there, and he still performed that kind of preemptive, containment, action against the enemy attacks, and still sheltering, covering a bit the retreat of the munitions at the end of the day. It's important also for the space of maneuver, in the need of recompacting the army, whether as we've seen in the left bank, the Colleoni would have been defeated, etc. There had to be enough space there not to be directly engaged by the enemy as well. So at this point, 2,000 archers, crossbowmen, and arquebusiers were thrown in the melee by Federico, that sees the robust Venetian ranks approaching, and thus a very thick exchange of arrows and arquebuses shots is exchanged, let's say, by across the two river banks. So the main engagement would take place there, right? The stream was enough to be crossed, but it's an important obstacle, right? So cavalry has to watch out, and there is this hellfire from both sides that is pretty impressive. The stereotype that we can talk about at this point is that fundamentally Colleoni would have had more culverines and falconets. So this lighter artillery that he had mounted in carriages, imagining to carry out this important hit-and-run tactics and shooting with a high frequency at close distance against the enemy with devastating result, and that, however, from the other side, there were more handgunners, right, arquebusiers, so-called scoppettieri, and so on, and especially as we've seen, the Bolognese were mostly about that, and they had an important amount of infantry. So it is a plausible picture, but the enemy, the Montefeltro would have artillery too, right? So and of course the Venetians had handgunners as well. So we don't know by which proportion these things counterbalance each other, but probably they were close, because as you will see, the battle fundamentally simply didn't end, right? Nobody managed to break into each other's ranks because of that. There are some interesting tactics performed, as we were saying before. Biondo says that infantry advanced from Colleoni's side and then eventually opened like a ventagle, and in the mid there was artillery that's shot at a point-blank range against the enemy. And all this because of the preparation of the crews and the capacities that it boasted, all these things. We don't really know whether this is true or not. And the interesting thing is that there's kind of a first mention of this in the sources. more than else from both sides, and this is kind of a, if you think about in the history of, in military history, it's an interesting first mention occurring in this specific context, right? Also, I don't know, even the Este were renowned for having good artillery. The Italians had some of the finest artillery out there. The Italian and French artilleries were the most advanced at the time. And especially the Italians had these kind of greater differentiation and kind of more technological refinement of also the smaller pieces. And this may be actually the direct proof of that, right? Whereas the French would organize larger artillery parks, and that would be more evident during the Italian wars some decade later. And however, there is also a more traditional way of fighting, as there is properly a melee. In this difficult terrain, where that is really good for ambushes, for difficult for cavalry, especially, so a bit the realm of infantry, for that matter. And this is a problem also for the sake of maneuverability. Not just because of the terrain itself, but also because of all the infantry scattered here and there, right? Even also to launch a well-ordered cavalry charge, you don't have to have anyone in the middle, right? And during all this, the shooting goes on, right? And as far as we understand, the area that saw the greatest fight was the Riccardina area itself, right? So this was this kind of stronghold where the Montefeltro encamped, and the shooting occurred. And in this situation, the stream was crossed in multiple points by both sides, but the mud bogged men and horses. So before this state of things had properly taken place, the Colleoni had to get rid of the enemy presence from the left bank, right? When he had reached the bridge, and as we've seen, there had been a vanguard there that had already passed, but the Orsini had rose up on the left bank from Budrio, and there was a heavy clash that seemingly was put to an end, and probably at this point Orsini retreated in some way, because the enemy would occupy the area, as far as we understand. We don't know whether he crossed back, whether he went simply south along the riverbank, we don't know. But that axis north-south possibly was exploited in that sense. So they were fighting from different directions. There are sources say that at this point, Colleoni risked concretely to be wiped out, because he was, Alessandro Sforza was under very heavy pressure in San Martino, and the Orsini also was contending pretty hard the left bank of the Indice. So this was a critical moment that was apparently saved by Ercole d'Este, that arrived with his rear guard, and after a first assault of his men-at-arms, he had part of his crossbowmen dismounted to reinforce infantry that, at a precise order, began to attack the enemy horses, getting under their bellies and disemboweling them, and making the clumsy men-at-arms falling into on this tough ground because of their weight, etc. So infantry had an important role in here. This tactic, we've seen it often. Actually, every time we talk about medieval battles, there is at some point this thing of the infantry getting under the enemy cavalry at some point, probably during the same cavalry clashes, right? Because infantry at this point wouldn't have much of an offensive capacity, or at least or also an existing one. At least it was like throwing them against an important enemy. Most of the lead was taken by cavalry in itself. We know that Ercole d'Este was overthrown from his horse thrice during the battle, and he would get shot, as we've seen, in his foot by an enemy Espringalt as well. And some sources credit specifically to the Este that would himself, in another context later on, remember this in front of the Venetian Senate, that he had saved the day for the Colleoni at that point, right? So the Este were good. Like there is this, Colleoni had this whole company, etc. But in terms of military quality, the Este from Colleoni's side and the Sforza from the Montefeltro's one were credited as the best. The Sforza seemingly had the best cavalry here, had trained that, had equipped them at best during spring, and normally the Milanese had strong military at that point. And so, however, Colleoni's troops managed, so at this point I presume he and Este had completely crossed with their contingents the Indice River. That was the risk moment, as we were saying. They were leaving the bridge at their back, right? And that's why I believe that in the midst, from the other side, there was nothing. There was some obstacle like swamps and difficult terrain in general between the bridge and the Montefeltro, because otherwise at that point Montefeltro might have simply sent even a small detachment to contend the bridge to the enemy nowhere or another. Would have been a problem, also just psychologically speaking, right? Because at that moment you can't retreat freely, and from there it would have been a problem. And interestingly enough, Montefeltro and Colleoni at some point saw each other from the opposite banks, right? The Montefeltro was together with the Count of Vimercate, Giacomo della Padula would die in battle, and Ugo Sanseverino at that point. I don't know whether Sanseverino had come back or had simply sent his Neapolitans to San Martino, but he wasn't there, but probably he had led the charge, and so this also, he had led the attack, and this also says, it's a conflicting idea, had he come back, right, had they abandoned the northeastern sector? I don't think so, personally. At least, maybe this is a mistake from the source of the study that I consulted. Maybe it's just, ideally was in the staff of. And Colleoni's one is together with the Martinengo. There are his 3 sons-in-law. He had married his daughters to the Venetian, senators, and he wore his toque. It was a brimless beret that he displays also in the beautiful fresco from the castle of Malpaga about properly the Battle of Molinella, that some attribute either to the Fogolino or others to the Romani. It's a beautiful piece of art. I've inserted some pictures in here because it's literally today's battle. And Colleoni was in charge, right? He would have liked to wear his salade to actually join the fight, or at least coming close to it. But at least some attendants, discouraged him to risk his life at that point. His situation was serious indeed, and they had just normalized it, and they had all the problem coming back, as we've seen. So at some point, there is the full-scale Montefeltro attack, who sent in the Milanese cavalry, right? The men of Galeazzo Maria Sforza, however, was not present in combat because he had a quarrel with the same Montefeltro, and they didn't like each other very much. But at least his men fought. This was the elite of the Montefeltro army, and they were admired for their full plate armor, right? When they crossed, they had been in Bologna and Florence before these operations. They had been, recorded with their capacity. And this was a very fierce fight, right? Because the fire was going on. You can't presume also culverins, falconets being used against cavalry, right? Proper. So imagine the risk. Even if you are in full plate armor, this thing would, pass you from, from side to side. In the worst of eventualities, and the clash is being revived also because Federico has brought in all the troops towards the monastery of the Olivetans in the Riccardina and in the the towered palace of Accursio in the area, because this was the birthplace of the famous 12th, 13th century jurist, by the way, that we discussed in our medieval law series. But the Milanese have troubles in all this because the horses and the men are exhausted, right? Just even think these were full-plated horses, and they, as you know, the big one, they went for imagine in the weather and on the ground, they would tire themselves as well, right? This is what might have been really a disaster. You see, John II Bentivoglio was literally told, "Don't come here because it's too hot," right? And the way is too long, right? And think about under the sun on July the 25th in the afternoon, in full plate armor, and having to fight under fire. You don't want to be that guy, really. So this is a pretty intense moment, because still the Milanese do charge, right? And they end up actually slaughtered. They suffer at least very heavy casualties, for the simple reason that part of them are literally trapped by infantry on the marshes. Their horses get wounded, disemboweled, and they fall down, and the terrain is muddy, and the infantry finish them off. There are these shouts in the battle. The Coglione one was literally coglione. Coglione means literally coglione, which is in Italian is testicles. In fact, you can see on his coat of arms distinctly 3 pairs of testicles that were his family's pride, and this is a freaking bloodbath, right? This is even in here there are 2 different versions on who said the thing, either Coglione or Montefeltro, that during the clash, I think at least one says exactly, I think it's referred to these Forza men-at-arms that were bogged down and attacked by the infantry, and Coglione shouted in Italian something that translated would be no pillories but flesh, right? Because the meant was kill them, don't take them prisoner. And this was a hell of a of a mess, and it goes on, right? This situation fundamentally ends like this, in a stalemate, right? Federico da Montefeltro is credited to have charged at some point, to have been unhorsed by a Venetian infantryman, and he fought on foot, risking, of course, to be taken prisoner or to be killed, and eventually got on another horse and went away. The same Coglione risked his life in this, so that it was a very intense clash. And in all this, sun was starting to go down, and literally the fighters were exhausted, psychophysically speaking, and some were start to retreat, because this thing would fundamentally exhaust itself gradually, right? There is this episode about Coglione that while sending some sappers back on towards on the paths towards Molinella, he meets Ercole d'Este, brought by 2 men because he had been shot at his foot, and the Este complained while heartened by Coglione, and protested towards the firearms. And in fact, there is a passage in the 3rd canto of the Orlando Furioso by the Ariosto that tells the story, references to this specific episode, because he was writing for the Montefeltro and he was remembering that kind of. And so there were some last attacks, but basically all forces had been spent now. No element of the army was fresh, so at that point simply things go down. There were some last shots of Expringald, of culverins, some confused melee that did not modify the situation, and Coglione does maintain the possession of the bridge, right? So at this point, the whole thing loses. There are certain trumpet signals that basically say that the hostilities are over. There is even some moment of chivalry where Alessandro Sforza sees in the opposite field Federico da Montefeltro, and he actually crosses over and goes to him, and he calls him son because it's literally his son-in-law. And he tells him that at this point it's night and that both sides had made their duty, that honor was satisfied, and the two hugged. So that tells you also, before in the introduction we skipped all the dynastic ties existing between these people, but as we've seen, there were literally, this guy had his brother fighting from the other side. It was the Duke of Milan. And, how even ambiguous such political ties were, because as you understand, you have seen the rivalries, the quarrels, the thing, nobody really knew whose side was it, because that was literally what the Italian alleged balance was, right? You see, people think that after the peace of Lodi was just peace, right? It's not really true. Every once in a while, this is a good example, there would be some other clashes occurring. But just to maintain this equilibrium that at the end of the day wouldn't serve much against the external threats during the Italian wars, but this thing had been frozen also by the Ottoman conquest, especially, the Italians were technically next door, and they said, wait a second, let's stop killing each other for a moment, let's try to consolidate situations so that nobody can profit of our conflict. But conflict was inherent in this reality of, let's say, 30 states in a single country that would do kind of differently, and also being with the external interference. But we will make videos about this to explain it better. And in spite of what Machiavelli says, because he had his obsession against the condottieri, mercenaries in general, this was a bloody battle. Machiavelli is famous for saying that nobody died in this battle, just horses, and there was some prisoner. He should have been brought on that field and seen, in fact, the amount of dead. Among the wounded, there are names such as Carlo Fortebraccio, that would actually die the day after, Marco Pio, Giovanni Guarna dei Fobo dell'Anguillara. Among the dead, there are Braccio il Vecchio, Francesco Sanseverino, Pietro Gambara, Leonello Brandolini, Antonio Caldara, Jacopo della Padula, as we've seen, he was a field aide of Montefeltro himself. And there are some, especially the Florentine historians wrote abundantly, said that Cicco and Piero Ordelaffi from Forlì, Astorre Manfredi, Lord of Faenza, Bonifacio of Montferrat, and Sylvester was already Piccinino's officer, right, against also which Corleone had fought. The three sons-in-law of Corleone himself, that is Gerardo Gaspare and Jacopo Martinengo. The same Florentines Strozzi Acciaiuoli and Diotesalvi Neroni were quoted as having performed acts of valor, and from the side of the League, Orsini and Sanseverino are, quoted. This is interesting, especially the Papal States relied fundamentally solely on mercenaries, and this is interesting because Central Italy had the most warlike troops and leaders of all Italy. Right? If the Papal States had been something kind of more stouter in nature, like Milan or even Naples or Venice, it would have fielded basically the strongest army of the whole Italian one. So the Orsini were a very famous Roman family, and they performed well. Sanseverino, as we've seen, had this crucial role, also lost a relative. So there are other individuals that are signaled for the courage demonstrated with white steel, such as Buoso da Cotignola, Marsilio Torelli, the Count of Vimercate that we were talking about before, Giorgio della Zazzera, Antonio da Correggio, right? As we were saying before, Galeazzo Maria Sforza instead didn't participate to the clash because he had been literally sent away by Montefeltro because he was bothered by his arrogance. The guy was seemingly good looking and capable, but he was terrible, characterless. In fact, he would get assassinated. This was scrupulous, and so back in Milan. Also, the king of Naples, Ferdinand of Aragon, couldn't be there because he was committed elsewhere. The same John II Bentivoglio had been properly advised by the 16 Reggitori of Bologna not to go out of the city during, that because of the threat and the weather, etc. And there is the pretty heavy count also of losses, right? There are lengthy descriptions of properly the dead and the wounded that were basically collected into the neighboring churches, etc. But most dead were actually left to rot out there in the open. So much, in fact, that seemingly an epidemic broke out because of the decomposition. And maybe we can skip on this, but the body count specifically, or what could be from the sources like this. Ammirato speaks of 300 dead and 400 horses killed. The Bolognese chronicles of the time speak of a true massacre. Ghirardacci, that quotes the aforementioned chronicles, speaks of many dead and wounded, and so Baldi and Muzio. Machiavelli, as we've seen, have said that basically nobody was killed. But on the base of what we know overall, and also on the base of other authors, etc., we know that the dead were between 800 to 1,000, right? So this was actually consider how many troops were from both sides, and you realize 500 dead, say 400, 500 dead from armies of 12,000. Yeah, it's not a lot, but it's still consistent loss, and it's plausible given the nature of the engagement, the way also the two armies, as you understand, never directly clashed without a boundary, let's say without an obstacle between each other, and the whole situation was very confused. The troops were exhausted already before the battle began, basically, and still this clash was brought to an end by the night, and still it brought eventually to the end of hostilities. And so, in fact, this battle wouldn't have dramatic strategic consequences. The status quo was maintained, and things would go. Part of the reason why this battle maybe is not so famous, albeit it is actually important, is, as I was saying in the very beginning of the video, because it didn't change much, right? But still, as a tactical engagement, is very fascinating. Nobody says, who won or lost, because as you understand, the battle exhausted itself, right? It before the two could contend, could be knocked out. So at the end of the day, you see that Corleone's intent was frustrated, right? So we can say that basically the Italic League won, and Venice had to renounce to her ambition in central and southern Italy, but it's still worth seeing that still didn't, not much change for her anyway, that's pretty much it. So that's how I reconstructed the battle, even without too much, I would say, too much incongruences. It's just that we don't know, for example, the exact positions on the field. Like, there is a source, for example, stating that before the attack of Montefeltro, the last one, the mass one at the end, that there were two lines of enemies. And as far as, I haven't found any counter information, because Montefeltro was being advised by this guy. When I remember, said, if we attack that line, the one behind them will break as well. So this is interesting because it would suggest that there would be an in-depth deployment considering the axis perpendicular to the river, right? At least from from both sides, basically. At that point, surely it's obvious how, especially the Italics made use of reserves at the beginning to contain the various attacks from here and there, even almost managing to make the Colleone's attack failing altogether with the maneuver in itself, even though they had been caught by surprise themselves and were not in battle array themselves at the moment of the first contact. It might have been possible, however, that troops were properly stationed along the river, given that this would have facilitated the countering any kind of crossing attempt from the side of the enemy. So deploying depth in that situation, not with various lines side by side along the river, would have probably been a waste of useful deployment. And the thing is that, you see, there are different directions from which enemies arrived, right? So if you consider, for example, the Orsini role on the left bank, at that point, in order to face the enemy, presumably they fought at that point with the river on the side, right, in this kind of north-southern axis. So if they, at that point, Colleoni had to engage Montefeltro along the river, deployed in depth, right, perpendicular to the river itself, with various lines, maybe with the Este at his rear, he would have had to will the wall formation and to redeploy like that in such a difficult situation, whereas we've seen the clash was all confused. I don't think it's realistic, and still there was probably, as we've seen, that risk could be cut out in the retreat. So I'm prone to believe that there was some deployment in depth, right? The numbers were large enough, but there was a greater risk coming from the length of the river and the possible direction of attack than else, right? So also some outflanking, even from the very south, right? Let's imagine Montefeltro had sent somebody again across the river. If the enemy had not broadened the front, it might have not avoided that flanking. So by leaving other areas of the bank uncovered. So yeah, that's how I interpret it. And surely there was some other reserve elsewhere, right? As we were saying before, I don't think that bridge, for example, was left completely uncovered at some point. The presence of reserves is very clear in the case of Montefeltro, that especially retained the Sforza till the last attack. I don't know whether sources properly say the last attack, but still for a while that they entered at a certain point after the beginning of the engagement. And I can't see, and there is some other sources says that basically by night, during the Venetian retreat, Sanseverino pressed on the enemy up to the Molinella. So it's possible from that side that Sanseverino was kind of didn't have enough strength to attack the whole enemy army that, as we've seen, had been he was spent but kind of largely intact, and also his own troops would have been spent against the Sforza. Also, we don't know where he went at that point. He would have retreated himself. We know that torches were lightened at a certain point when darkness fell, right? That's how late they actually kept fighting, and that's pretty much it, right? I can't think of another situation that might have unlocked. Another perplexity is the disposition of the Este compared to Colleoni, because, as we've seen, Colleoni sent his first vanguard across the bridge, then he crossed himself, then, as we've seen, the Este were the rear guard at that point, but sources say that against the Orsini, the fight was contended also by the Este, so the Este should have crossed through the Colleoni's lines and also the Venetian vanguard. How did that happen? Right? How did that happen? That's something I couldn't resolve personally, and it might have been the advance was much less disordered than we think, but still, not at the point you would have this too much game of movements, etc. I mean, these ranks, as we've seen, were many. The Este had 1,000 cavalry. That's not just a few, right? So you need some space for maneuver. You can't bypass whichever line. There must be some kind of order. And as we've seen, the situation was already terrifying from an atmospheric, from a terrain point of view. You don't even think of losing more time like that, right? Maybe so. This is interesting because you see, Este was told to have properly engaged in that phase, properly to have sent his cavalry in, and then some other dismounted cavalry in to support evidently some other infantry, maybe its own. That I couldn't understand, but seemingly, those Venetians and Coloni were probably already engaged with the enemy. So that is not clear. That is possibly the position of Este and Coloni relatively to each other, but that I haven't properly understood. And I hope at some point to get properly my hands on the actual sources of the battle, and to see some, at least the ones that I couldn't find, and to clarify what the hell happened in if there is the possibility of clarifying it, because as you see, there are some actions in this battle attributed from one author to one side and by an author to the other. So how reliable is that? How can we know, heuristically speaking, how far can we go? That can't be properly told, right? So my idea is practically that probably there's not much to know itself. Also because if these things had been known, probably, well, you can never say that there would have been probably an historiography talking more about that, but I think that the rationalization of sources is maybe too much for such distant authors like the ones that are discussing this. But anyhow, I'll let you know if there is something new for because I'm interested in general, right? I reconstruct battles for a living. Specifically, that's what I do. I specialize in tactics. I wrote that thesis, 700 pages, fundamentally just about taking source by source and reconstructing the battle. When I lack these, I get frustrated because I realize how easily just one word, one mention, one phrase can literally flip the whole thing. So however, I think that more or less we got how things went, right? Essentially, there isn't any kind of other army or complex maneuver for at least we know this, and it all in all it's all logical, right? Corleone's strategy is fascinating because he probably wanted to compensate for that numerical disadvantage by pinning the enemy down on the river bank with his combined arms tactics, including cavalry charges, artillery shot, and infantry, containment. So that probably worked, right? It to me, it may be kind of a cliche that it was more advantage in artillery, but several sources basically hint at that, and given this tactical behavior, I believe he probably was, right? And that for this reason, he also, the fact that he was the one with the initiative and attacking and going as far as that, right, trying to take by surprise the enemy, I think he relied on his firepower, at least, right? He relied on this capacity of inflicting losses, of hammering the enemy. And he was probably frustrated also because the numerical inferiority didn't allow him to actually attack the enemy on multiple fronts with kind of a decisive anvil there that could hammer, that could knock the enemy out while he was behaving like an anvil on the river, but still trying to attack in a sense. So it would have been very interesting to see this battle, how it was fought and how things went, but unfortunately we will never know about that. Surely though, I think some little step forward can be made to ascertain how the various units were properly deployed, etc. Right, so again, I'll let you know if I know something more. And also, I'm happy we talked about. This is our first condottieri battle, right? And we made a very few on the condottieri. We will keep talking about them a lot because they actually fought a lot, right? The myth that Machiavelli spread about the bloodless battles and also this kind of idea of a peace, of an equilibrium, actually wasn't there, right? These people basically fought each other all the freaking time, and they had matured some of the finest military expertise around in Europe. Like the Venetian condotta system, as Corleone proved, was together with the Bande d'Ordonnance of Charles the Bold were the most advanced armies of their times, right? And there is all a statal dynamic there that is forerunning, and even probably the Italian wars altogether do not render quite the entire justice to, right? Now, because it's easy to say, well, okay, the feudal monarchies were taking over and these states were all yeah, but the problem is political, right? The problem is that these city-states all thought about their own thing, and they wouldn't have a unitary conception, right? Even this Italic League was pretty loose, but militarily wise, there were some of the leading transformations in European warfare in Italian warfare. So it's very important to recall how far they had gone and what they were doing, how and why they would do that, right? Because these armies were updated for time standards and deserve probably more recognition than one is usually credited to them. It's just that the system was very particular from a political and social point of view, and given that if you take out that context, you can never fully appreciate what this was about. And that's also why Machiavelli tells that thing, because aside from his idiosyncrasies against mercenarism, he properly discounts the military efforts as you understand for this battle, like claiming that nobody died. Right, this is just plain false on the base of sources of evidence. So, and this was actually a bloody battle, and it wasn't even a whole-day fight, and it was in some atrocious circumstances. So you think about that because it's really fascinating. But for now, we stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.